Good evening and welcome to the second part of our two-part series about anti-Semitism, a bipartisan problem that demands a nonpartisan solution. A few weeks ago, many of you joined us for the first part of this series, which was confronting anti-Semitism on the left. And so tonight, we're delighted that so many of you are joining us for the second part, confronting anti-Semitism on the right. The idea for this program, which began with a conversation between the Philadelphia ADL and Philadelphia JCRC, was that anti-Semitism is a bipartisan problem and that the charge of anti-Semitism is sometimes weaponized by people on both sides of the aisle, which does not at all help the cause of fighting anti-Semitism. If you're serious about fighting anti-Semitism, you need to fight it from wherever it comes, and especially when it comes from people that you often agree with, who you're often in spaces with and working with. So we brought together leaders from both sides of the aisle to talk about it, who are willing to have courageous conversations to confront the problems they saw in the spaces where they are affiliated, and who are talking about how they handle anti-Semitism when they see it. So I want to remind you that tonight we're focused on anti-Semitism on the right. We did have the conversation about anti-Semitism on the left, and after this program, we will share that link again with that recording. But tonight we're going to focus where we are. And I also want to remind you that the conversation doesn't end tonight. This is ongoing work that we all should be engaged in, calling out anti-Semitism wherever we see it, wherever it comes from. So I'm delighted tonight that we have a special guest, Bill Kristol, who has been a leading participant in American political debates and a widely respected analyst of American political developments for over 3 decades. He served in senior positions in the Reagan White House and the White House of George H.W. Bush. And so he gets government from the inside, but he's also been an observer and a student of government from the outside and serving as a professor at both the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard. Now, as founding director of Defending Democracy, Together, an organization dedicated to defending America's democratic norms, principles, and institutions, and serving as editor-at-large of The Bulwark, a news network launched in 2018, dedicated to providing political analysis and reporting free from the constraints of partisan loyalties or tribal prejudices. He's in the midst of the national conversation and debate on issues ranging from foreign policy to the future of the Republican Party and the meaning of American conservatism. Welcome, Bill Kristol. And in conversation with Bill is Dr. Sharon Nazarian, who is ADL's Senior Vice President for International Affairs. In this role, Sharon acts as Foreign Minister of the ADL, meeting with heads of state, foreign ministers, and leaders of Jewish communities across the globe. And she leads ADL's work fighting anti-Semitism and racial hatred globally. She also oversees our ADL office in Israel. So welcome, Sharon and Bill. I'll turn it over to you. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Use that function, and I will make sure they get to Sharon. I'm sure we'll have a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shira, so much. Good evening, everyone. It's really an honor for me to be moderating this program, especially with Mr. Kristol. And I have to tell the audience that Bill has been kind enough to allow me to refer to him by his first name, Bill. So Bill, welcome.
Thank you.
We look forward to a wonderful conversation.
I do too. So let's
go.
Take it away.
All right. So as Shira said, Bill, we're really talking tonight about countering anti-Semitism on the right. We discussed last month on the program how progressives can really counter anti-Semitism on the left. So the right is a very broad concept. What do you think we need to know about the American right today in America in order to really understand how anti-Semitism manifests in the right?
Yeah, it's a big question and a good question. I mean, it's first of all, it's good to be with you, Sharon, and all of you, and with ADL. I got to Washington in 1985 to work in the education department in the Reagan administration, and I think became chief of staff, and I think I had my first meeting with spoke maybe at a regional ADL conference in '86 or '87. There were lots of education issues we worked with the ADL on. Then I was in the George H.W. Bush White House, as was mentioned, and it was Dan Quayle's chief of staff. And this shows how much things have changed in a certain way for the better, I'd say, on the Republican side. I think I was the only Jew on the senior staff of the George H.W. Bush White House, senior staff being the top 15 or 20. And they were not anti-Semitic or anything like that. There just weren't many Republicans, many Jews in the Republican Party, or Jews who had been in there a little while so as to be able to get to the senior staff level. And I remember talking with friends like Elliot Abrams and other Jewish Republicans about this quite a bit. So this will actually be a way of answering your question. And I remember doing a lot with ADL during those years. And so it's great to, and I've done stuff on and off since. So it's good to be with you. I mean, I think in a way, if you stop the clock at 2015, let's say, so I came to Washington in 1985. So let's say those 30 years, it's a pretty happy story, really, of a decline of anti-Semitism on the right and in Republican circles. You know, I'd say when I got there in 85, there was still that kind of old not real fierce or really very dangerous anti-Semitism mostly, but a kind of, you know, country club, pro-Arab, oil states, old-fashioned republicanism. So a little bit of that, frankly, in the George H.W. Bush administration, people from Texas, perfectly decent people, but not that attuned perhaps to the concerns of Jews, not so pro-Israel, and not so alert perhaps to various forms of anti-Semitism. But that was kind of the old country club, you might say. I call it sort of mild or anti-Semitism, more sins of omission than a commission. But then there was the rise of Pat Buchanan, who ran against us, against Bush and Quayle in 92, and then was a major figure through the 90s. I opposed him, many people did. And he really was driven out of the Republican Party and ended up as the reform candidate, I think it's called, in 2000. Then there was Ron Paul in 2008. He got some votes in Iowa. I remember talking to my good friend Charles Krauthammer about him. Could this really be a revival of a kind of older kind of American populist anti-Semitism? But then he went nowhere. And then we had McCain, we had Romney and Paul Ryan, like John Boehner. I mean, whatever you think of these people's politics, the major figures in the Republican Party in around 2012, 2015, I would say, we're not, we're pretty, knew plenty of Jews. It wasn't like the old times. They had gotten Jewish votes in many cases, more not as many as the Democrats, but a fair number. They had governed well, whether it was Jeb Bush, and they had cordial relations with the Jewish community, cordial relations with the ADL itself, I would bet. Jeb Bush in Florida, Bobby Jindal in Louisiana. I mean, you just kind of think of the different people who were running, John Kasich in Ohio, and it felt like things were pretty good. And then things changed. With Trump, I don't think it's entire. Trump is both a symptom and a cause of the problem of a kind of unleashing of a populist sentiment, populist, nativist, authoritarian sentiments, which had been suppressed for quite a while. They'd been beneath the surface, more of them there than some of us realized or wanted to perhaps realize, but still suppressed. My friend Charlie Sykes talks about all the nativism and authoritarianism, even racism, anti-Semitism as being a recessive gene in the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And the bad news is it was there, probably more than we realized. The good news is it was recessive, and so it didn't really manifest itself too much. And of course, the party was very pro-Israel by this point. So I would have thought, we thought things were okay. But once that recessive gene got released, if you will, once nativism and bigotry more broadly, I would say, and mean-spiritedness and xenophobia all got released, a fair amount of anti-Semitism came chugging out with it. I don't know that anti-Semitism was the lead thing. It wasn't. Trump personally didn't do much with that. He was attacking Mexican judges and Muslim immigrants and so forth. But it's a very good lesson, a very good reminder that one form of bigotry tends to legitimize and encourage many forms or many aspects of bigotry, many assaults on many different objects of bigotry. So now we have a populist, authoritarian, nativist sort of conservatism. It's unfortunately has had a very good run, a very bad run for the country, but very good for them for 5 or 6 years. Trump presidency, Trump's still the leader of the party, and all kinds of things have therefore emerged on the right that I would have thought had been, as I said, suppressed or at least submerged. And I think that's very worrisome. And it doesn't mean that some of the individual leaders in Congress, it wouldn't be fair to say they're anti-Semitic. They're really not, and many of them, have pro-Israel. That's another issue we'll talk about. But what has come, the kind of politics that has emerged on the right in the last 5, 6, 7 years has become dominant on the right is a kind of politics in which the virus of anti-Semitism, unfortunately, can breed and multiply.
So Bill, staying in the 70s, 80s a little bit, at that time, again, my perspective is very much an international lens. And I can imagine those times that, the lens of the Republican Party was, and through the Israel lens, had to do with the Arab countries, with oil and access to oil. Talk to us a little bit about the effect of kind of how Israel was viewed in the Republican Party of the 80s and 70s, 80s, and so on.
Yeah, and I think it was a mix, honestly. I mean, I was personally sort of a Pat Moynihan, Scoop Jackson, Hubert Humphrey Democrat I was a kid in the late 60s and then in the early 70s. I worked for Moynihan in 76 in the primary in New York after he had been UN ambassador and given that famous speech denouncing the Zionism as racism resolution in 75. So, for people like me, that sort of liberal anti-communism that was pro-Israel and very attuned to anti-Semitism was kind of the world I moved in. The Republicans were more complicated. I mean, Nixon, in a way, Richard Nixon is a pretty good embodiment. Privately said some pretty bad things that that have come out on the tapes and all this. Publicly respectful, though, you've got to say, of Jews. He wasn't going around leading any kind of attempts to exclude them. Some of his closest advisors in the Nixon White House, who he seems to have treated well personally, despite what he then said later at night to Haldeman, after a couple of drinks, were Jewish. And on Israel, he was, you can debate the policies, but he was not anti-Israel. And in fact, in 73, arguably really came to Israel's defense. So I think the Republican Party of that era was mixed, a little bit of sort of real anti-Semitism from the sort of bubbling up from some grassroots types, maybe more in the South, a little bit of country club reservations about Jews and their effect on the culture, and also about Israel because of the Arab, their affinity for the Arab states. But I think that really changed with Reagan. I mean, Reagan, and maybe this, history often depends on individuals, right? I'm not sure. Could have gone in a different direction. Reagan happened to be very popular with Christian conservatives, kind of a populist of a kind, but also personally very pro-Israel. I remember when I realized that, I hadn't, I knew he was, obviously he was governor of California, but I didn't have much of a sense of his thoughts about that. He gave a very moving, extemporaneous, very brief remarks on the occasion of the Entebbe raid in 1976, which I just randomly heard. I think I was in New York at the time on the radio. And I mean, he really had a sort of real admiration for what Jonathan Netanyahu had done and so forth. So once Reagan became the leader of the party during the 80s, and George Shultz, and then the administration got staffed by people like my friend Elliot Abrams and many others. It was a pretty pro-Israel and pretty, I won't quite say philo-Semitic, but not interested in the older elements of Republican bigotry. And one really thought at that time that was just history. Henry Ford and all this stuff in the 20s and 30s, Charles Lindbergh. It just seemed like another America First. It seemed like another era. I mean, it's, for me, when Trump said America First, I remember thinking, well, that's just crazy. And it got to be a mistake for him to embrace that term. That term had been sort of, relegated to the outskirts of American politics for 70 years by the time Trump used it, and had connotations, of course, with Lindbergh of genuine anti-Semitism. Not everyone who was in it was anti-Semitic. They were just some mistaken isolationists and so forth. But and when Trump embraced it, and when there was no big pushback, and then a lot of people decided they liked it, some of them used it in more innocuous ways, to be sure. But that, I think, is a real sign. I just think of one instance, a party that had been engaged partly in America First, repudiates it after Pearl Harbor, obviously, moves away from it, I think pretty steadily, you could say, through most of the next decades. And then in 2015, 16, re-embraces it, not of course, every aspect of it, but in a way that really is damaging. And then 2017 with Charlottesville, obviously, was a big moment, I think, where people really saw some of the implications of what was happening on the right. So I think whatever doubts one might have had about individuals in the Republican Party, some of the members of the Senate, there were some Republican interest groups in the 70s and 80s and 90s. That was a very different kind of problem than the post, let's call it 2016 problem that we face.
So in that pre-2016 era, you as a prominent conservative, as a prominent member of the Republican Party, were there examples of anti-Semitism that you felt personally? Were there personal moments for you where you felt like, I really feel like this is uncomfortable for me? Because I want to contrast that with today. I really want to, I'm getting to today right now in a moment, but I just want to really do the contrast with 2016.
I mean, I would say a few, mostly people not realizing that, the kinds of holidays that people took for granted and expressions that were used that were, Christian in terms of opening prayers at Republican dinners. But I think most of that was really ignorance and not being very thoughtful, not hostility, and not even hidden hostility. I mean, by 2010, when the party had become so pro-Israel and it had become a distinguishing element politically against President Obama, again, fairly or unfairly, but the Republicans thought I think it was genuine. They thought President Obama was wrong about Iran and other things, but also they used it politically against him. It became almost embarrassing how, pro-Israel and even pro-Jewish they seemed to be, or tried to seem to be. They would sort of go out of their way to sort of say, we're Republicans, we believe in low taxes, and we're pro-life and pro-gun and pro-Israel. I remember I heard this once at a dinner in the South, and I thought, it's kind of, fine. If they have they're pro-life, they're pro-gun, they're pro-low taxes. That's kind of the standard Republican platform, you might say. Pro-Israel, just kind of, and it wasn't said because I was there. I really am convinced. I asked someone afterwards, was that just thrown in because I was the, guest speaker or something like that? It was just a generic, state party dinner. It was nothing really important or controversial. And the person told me, no, that's just a standard formulation these days. So that's kind of funny. So anyway, I didn't have much in the way of, this is a more kind of ignorance. And then people say, hey, maybe we should have a Hanukkah party at the White House. Would that be a good, what do you do at a Hanukkah party? There was more sort of, they hadn't grown up in a culture, in an area, in a milieu, in a geographical area, really, where there were tons of Jewish students. Everyone forgets how late a lot of that happened, especially, if you go up in New York, of course, it was a totally different world than Philadelphia and Chicago, pretty much. We moved to Northern Virginia here in '85. We've lived here for 36 years, and our kids went to public schools here, and our synagogue, bar mitzvah here, and bat mitzvah here, and my wife is president of the synagogue here, and so forth. So now head of the JCC here. So we're very up on things here in Northern Virginia. And I would say that it was interesting, even in the late 80s, the Jewish community here is more in Maryland and somewhat Northwest DC than Virginia. And so people didn't know much about Jews. I remember having I think it was Susan and a couple of people going to the Fairfax County School Board and saying, look, you probably should, you don't have to give everyone a holiday on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. It's not like New York, they're only 5% of the kids or something like that. But, you shouldn't hold it against, you should give the kids a chance to make up the work later and not sort of penalize them for being absent. And again, there was no hostility. It was just like, we never really had to deal with this much here in Virginia, at least in this part of Virginia, a little bit. Richmond would be a little different. Anyway, so I didn't, but I can't say in all honesty that I encountered many problems.
So kind of looking at the underpinnings of what led up kind of the 2016 and then post 2016 changes that you're pointing to, there's two things that I just want to raise with you and you can talk about. One is kind of the evangelical movement and the influence of that movement on the Republican Party. And two is kind of the mainstreaming of some of the ideology from ultranationalists, from kind of right-wing extremists, what we call today the great replacement theory, these ideas that have always been there. They've been on the sidelines. They've always kind of been shunned. And now they kind of got mainstreamed. And we at ADL obviously track that very closely. So if you can talk about each of those influences and they've manifested, how they become part of what I would say kind of a broader agenda today in our political discourse, and obviously showing up more in Republican sectors than in others.
Yeah, on the second, I really think you put it well. And I would just say, there were people who've been, pushing these terrible, bigotry and terrible and ridiculous theories for a while and getting nowhere much, I think. They'd occasionally flare up. So I was in the George H.W. Bush White House in 1990, 91, and David Duke ran for governor of Louisiana. And we quietly waited to try. But people forget how much of the vote he got. He led the first round, as I recall, that they have that runoff system in Louisiana for governor. And then we waited behind the scenes, and then actually President Bush came out publicly and said, you can't elect this guy, even though the alternative was a Democrat. And so Bush urged Louisianans to break party lines, and they did defeat David Duke. But everyone thought, I remember at the time, I was quite engaged and talked to people in Louisiana and so forth. I ran into Mitch Landrieu, the former mayor of New Orleans, at a conference a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about he was involved as a much younger person in this on the ground in Louisiana too. So this kind of thing would flare up, but then, you didn't hear much about David Duke in the next, 20 years, right? So all that stuff has turned out was still around. I do think I come back to what I said earlier, that when you unleash various forms of bigotry, and they may be quite different from each other, of course, and when you legitimize the expressions of hatreds and resentments and people's, and you exploit people's anxieties and when there's a presidential candidate who does it, not just the governor, but someone running for governor in one state. As David Duke may have done some damage in Louisiana, but he probably didn't make a big difference up here in Virginia or anywhere, much anywhere else. Presidential candidates have a very big bully pulpit, a very big platform. Presidents have a huge one. And I just can't, I think it's a mistake to underestimate the amount of damage that 4 years of divisive rhetoric, indulging in extremism, or in effect tolerating certain kinds of violence and violent sentiments, talking about real Americans. And with Trump, it wasn't even that. He's not religious, so it was kind of, he just meant, I think he meant much more race and ethnicity, honestly, and obviously with his own family situation and stuff. I think he thought the Jews were, some of them at least, the ones who he liked, were kind of part of his real America. But it turns out not everyone else agreed with Trump, right? I mean, that is to say, once you unleash this, the individual demagogue can be pro-Israel, he can even be pro-Jewish in some general sense. But the people who follow him, the people who listen to him, the imitation demagogues, at some point decide to kind of go the next step, where they realize, hey, there's another, card we can play here. So there are some actual, of course, anti-Semitic groups and people and individuals that are almost defined by the Jewish question, let's say. But there's a much bigger.
Charlottesville was really kind of the epitome of that, right?
Yes.
The Charlottesville tiki torches, right? The Jews
Totally.
will replace it. Right?
Yeah, no, that's really true. Though even there, it was sort of playing off, obviously, race with the statues. But no, absolutely. So that was sort of. But I remember everyone was. That's I think one reason that was so shocking. That was one, to be honest, is expected more of the kind of ethnic and racial nativism and a little less of the religious. That's the right way to put it. The bigotry. But no, once you unleash it, it comes from all over. And even if Trump personally, didn't promote it exactly, and most elected officials didn't promote it exactly, they certainly didn't repudiate it. And then it slides over from one thing to another. And so now we have the insane spectacle of, Josh Mandel in Ohio is going on and on about basically, we're a Christian country, though I knew him when he was like a normal Romney Republican, and he was proud to have been a Jewish Marine. There weren't that many of them. Our son was actually as well. So we even talked a lot about this. And so it's really terrible when Jews start being fostering, at least indirectly, I would say. He's usually careful to say Judeo-Christian or something like that, but fostering this kind of anti-Semitism. So for me, again, this is a very traditional ADL point, I believe, that it's, you can, obviously we all have our focuses on the groups we part of and we care about, and anti-Semitism is special in some ways, has been historically, but a lot of it is, you foster bigotry and extremism, you get eventually anti-Semitism, and vice versa. You foster anti-Semitism, you get other forms of bigotry and extremism. So I think on that front, that's kind of what, I do think 2015, 16 happened. It's hard to find objective events outside. One thing if you're in the Great Depression, and you can plausibly say Jewish bankers are doing very well or something, and the rest of us are, in the Dust Bowl and 24% unemployment. But that wasn't the country in 2016, and there were plenty of wealthy Jewish business people and others and people in Hollywood, but I don't know if there was any higher percentage than there had been 20 or 30 years before, or they were any more prominent, So I really, it's hard to know quite what outside triggers there were. But again, that's a lesson, I think. You don't need the outside triggers, or they're just somewhat random. People pick them up because they hear about someone, but it really is much more the playing on the anxieties, the legitimating of hatred and bigotry. For me, that's really the key thing that Trump did, and that has changed the character of the American right. There was always some of that there, maybe more of it, as I say, than people like me wanted to acknowledge. But once it's legitimated, it really, the whole thing changes. And then once it's legitimated, also people start to indulge in it. They don't pay a price. I don't think many of them would pay much for a price. And indeed, they kind of like it, I mean, this is a terrible thing about bullying or bigotry. If it's repressed, and that's good, frankly, even if you can't change people's inner souls, whatever they say at midnight or something to a close friend. That's very different from saying these things out loud in public and enjoying it, and then feeling, hey, that was great. We're liberated from all that political correctness, and and that part is really, once that gets unleashed, this is what worries me the most. It's hard to put back. Once people start enjoying this kind of performative bigotry, even if it doesn't really manifest itself most of the time in actual discrimination against someone, or even actual violence against someone, or even if some of these people don't even think that they also have a neighbor who's Jewish, whom they're actually perfectly decent to, perhaps, or their kid plays with their kid, on a Little League team. But once you unleash the kind of even the performative aspects at the rallies and so forth, I think it's very dangerous.
Well, Bill, I would posit that, the trends that you're describing are actually global trends that, it's definitely my team and I look at when we look at Europe and the rise in kind of ultranationalist, right-wing extremists, kind of normalization of their narratives, coming into the political sphere, being part of now coalitions and governments, whether it's in Austria or it's in Germany, what we're seeing also in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary. Definitely, you touched on it very clearly, putting the finger on the social anxieties that all of us are feeling, whether it has to do with, mass movement of people. Europe was very sensitive to all the refugees coming from Iraq and Syria and coming in some ways, those feeling that it's changing the whole character of Europe, from this Judeo-Christian to now this diverse, Muslims and Arabs and others coming in. So these anxieties that we at ADL really are very attuned to, leading to xenophobia. And we know that with xenophobia, obviously right at the helm of that oftentimes becomes, anti-Semitism is right there. So these are global trends that we've noticed. And again, in America, very similar, whether it's economic anxieties, it's, when Trump was referring to the, Mexican caravans coming in, this is about the other coming in and really infiltrating your life, your culture, your society. And that's where the great replacement comes from. You are literally being replaced by others.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I totally agree. I'd make a couple of points that just in addition, you don't need, of course, many Jews for this whole thing to take off either. It's not like it's actually, a heck of a lot of Jews, and for obvious reasons, in Central and Eastern Europe and most of those countries. So the notion that you explain it by, well, there are Jews here whom they resent, that's not true. That it is simply finding a historic object of bigotry to appeal to, when it could be as unreasonable or reasonable as, it's never reasonable, but it can be as sort of small or large in the country as a whole. It doesn't matter that much. It doesn't seem actually, in that respect. So I very much, I very much agree with that.
By the way,
I had another point, but it'll come back to me, but I forgot.
Yeah, no, I want to point to the Tree of Life attack that happened in Pittsburgh. Yeah. The perpetrator, the rationale that he used was that Jewish groups were bringing refugees into America in the design and with the mission of, diversifying and definitely taking away the prominence of the white citizens of this country. So it was all about kind of pointing to the Jews who were bringing in others in that, would change the character of America. So even in that case, Jews were essentially blamed.
Yeah, in this respect, Jews have I'm sure people have studied this. It's an interesting group to blame. Is you can sort of find a group that's a little bit of an outside group, despite all the, being less outside now than 100 years ago in America, that's bringing in real outside groups and groups that they really don't like in terms of, just pure kind of race bigotry and so forth, and ethnic bigotry. And sort of it's a way of justifying they can't very well say that, I don't know, Jews aren't functioning well in America or something like that, or Jews are committing a lot of crimes. I mean, well, there's no real ground, I would say, for that kind of anti-Semitism. So, but the Jew is the kind of clever manipulator of these other groups. So that's very pernicious. Because, I mean, the trouble with all these conspiracy theories is they're not really falsifiable. I mean, that's almost by definition a conspiracy theory. The more it looks like you say, well, there's no evidence for that, well, that's how clever they are, right? I mean, I think a lot of people have spent a lot of time, and I don't know how much good it's done, unfortunately, of, well, proving that things are forgeries and other things are false and other things are ridiculous and so forth. But at some point, if people, this is the sad truth, right? I mean, the fact checking doesn't always stop the bigotry and the appeals. But you're absolutely right about being a global phenomenon and spilling over into, I don't know how much of it started. I mean, again, this is a long history of this, but Jews are a very convenient part of this narrative, sometimes as the threat themselves, sometimes as the George Soros clever type who's manipulating other people to be threats, but always a threat to this kind of, the real America, the true nation, the people, the real people of the country, and so forth. I am struck how much it's become explicitly Christian. I don't know if you think this is true in other countries in the last few years. And I don't think it's really Christian. I mean, I think most of these people, would be shocked if they go to church more than 3 times a year or something like that. I don't think they're sitting around reading the Gospels or whatever. But it is interesting how they've slid from sort of a kind of exaggerated, kind of cartoonish almost patriotism, which isn't patriotism, becomes nationalism and a kind of Americanism sort of thing. It's now slid into Christian Americanism. You see that much more. And again, I don't think that's really, the people doing that are not mostly Christian leaders, but they are, somehow that's, again, I think kind of typical slide, for people to make once you get into this game, as you say, of treating some groups as others, because at the end of the day, it's the majority of the country's Christian. So it's pretty easy to start using that as one of the weapons to weaponize that as well. I'd say one other thing I just remember what I was going to say. I think your international comparison is very useful too, because I do feel personally, people used to talk about American exceptionalism. This became kind of a Republican conservative talking point, over the last 10, 20 years. It was originally a social science term that had it was an analytical term. Marty Lipset, who was actually a friend, a great friend, Seymour Martin Lipset, a great friend of the ADL and other Jewish community groups when he was alive, studied the rise of communism and fascism in Europe. And one of the questions the social scientists asked, this came out of German social science originally, why not in America? There's communist parties and fascist parties in Germany and Italy and some places where they didn't take power, France. America, not much, a little bit in the 30s, but not much. And there were various explanations, and people cited Tocqueville, and people cited other historical factors, and many, many interesting pieces of history and social science written on this. But I think all of us, at a certain age at least, maybe imbued a certain kind of American exceptionalism in the sense that we really thought it couldn't happen here. Whatever, terrible things have happened in Europe, terrible things could always therefore come back. It didn't seem so far-fetched. It seemed a little far-fetched at times, but after 89, but you sort of knew that it could happen there. One really thought that we were beyond whatever signs of that we'd seen here. I think it's been very, very important for people to be serious about, at the end of the day, human nature is human nature. And if a country is full of has demagogic leaders who prey on and foster anxieties and hatreds and are willing to tolerate things that they wouldn't have a few years ago, and talk about violence and appeal to violence and talk about certain things in ways that exclude others, it can lead to the same consequences, on this side of the Atlantic as on other sides, and in countries that speak English as well as countries that speak other languages. I think the American exceptionalism remains a little bit, there's still too much complacency, I would say, about the problem. You're not about, and again, it's very important to distinguish, it doesn't mean there's going to be a pogrom tomorrow or something. I think that would look, but the degree to which it can spill over and really become dangerous and much faster than people thought. This is one problem with history. Once you read the history of Germany in the 20s and 30s, it all kind of vaguely seems, well, of course, Weimar was very weak, and of course it was going to go in this direction. But it wasn't, of course, and most people didn't think it was going to. And if they thought Weimar was weak, they thought it would lead to some kind of, pre-1914 German type state, not insane, Hitlerism and Nazism, in the most culturally advanced country in Europe with one of the most flourishing Jewish communities, great scholars, musicians, etc. So I think it's very important to step back from American exceptionalism and be sober about the dangerous possibilities that are out there.
So maybe that brings us to January 6th and what happened in our nation's capital. I'd love to kind of hear your assessment of it. How did you see this? Was this a watershed moment in your view? Was this a real threat to our democracy? How do you assess that day in our nation's history?
I mean, it should have been a watershed moment, and it should have been a watershed moment for the Republican Party and for conservatives to finally say, okay, enough. We've seen how this can go. And so let's make sure we don't repeat this and don't continue what was happening. But of course, after 48 hours, that quickly was lost. And now I think we're in, it's had the opposite effect almost. I mean, people are defending it and people are minimizing it and rationalizing it. And Trump is as dominant in the party, and extremists are as dominant in the party. And Josh Mandel is running the kind of campaign he's running now, not before January 6th. And Marjorie Taylor Greene and the whole Matt Gaetz and the whole crew are that they're mostly post-January 6th figures, right? Somewhat, not some that were around before. So that's very depressing and worrisome. I mean, I just think if you were again a social scientist looking at it, you'd say, boy, this stuff is a little more entrenched than I thought. You'd think it would get sort of, scared out of the system, as it were, or shocked out of the system by January 6th. The only other point I'd make about January 6th is I think it is important January 6th was terrible, and it was, horrible to see, especially for those of us who live near there and live near the pretty close to the Capitol, across the river, but obviously worked in Washington and government. Kind of just so shocking, but for everyone as well, everyone else as well. But November 3rd to January 6th, I mean, the fact that a president could deny an election result, could try to use the Justice Department and Homeland Security and the Defense Department to figure out ways to overturn it, that he didn't get away with it exactly, but tried to pressure state officials. But it was a little closer than it could have been, and some people stood up to him. But it turns out we have a pretty rickety system, which we've sort of been able to get away with because we haven't had much in this way of bad behavior, really bad behavior. And so at the end of the day, if you have weak guardrails and no one drives into them or crashes into them or tries to remove them, then the weak guardrails just stay there. And you think, oh, we have good guardrails, But then it turns out when someone really goes after them, they're pretty weak now. But then I would say one of the scary things and worrisome things is, what have we done to strengthen them since January 6th? And there are complicated reasons why Congress hasn't passed various anti-election subversion acts, and why state legislatures have gone in the wrong direction mostly, and why in other respects on issues of education policy and books being removed from the libraries, we're seeing more illiberalism, not less. But all in all, again, if this were a foreign country and you looked at it, you said, well, they had this thing on January 6th, but how did they react to that? They're not getting better. If anything, parts of it are getting worse. I think you'd be pretty alarmed. And I was just at a conference where someone was talking about what's happening, not so much in the military itself, though that's a little worrisome, but the National Guard, which is less, part-time soldiers, so kind of less under the control, you might say, full-time control of military rules and regulations, and the law enforcement community, again, especially in some parts of the country, sheriff's offices, which are less carefully guided, I think you could say, by law, perhaps, than big police departments. They evade scrutiny. A lot of that, again, if you looked at that in a foreign country, Latin America or something, you'd think, this is pretty worrisome. The combination of the rhetoric from the elected officials, the bubbling up from below, the conspiracy theories, the increased radicalization of the rhetoric, the increased extremism of the rhetoric, where they're trying to top each other. I mean, all of that is not a happy picture.
So Bill, we at ADL, when we do our government advocacy, a lot of the points that we try to raise is calling out anti-Semitism in your own camp, the importance of that. And we're continually really coming to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and saying, you need to call this out in your own party, in your own side of the aisle when it happens. You've been very brave, within your world of conservatism in doing that. Why doesn't it happen more often? Why do you think that there's and you touched on it now, there's this kind of a period of environment of tolerance for all kinds of ideals that maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, were completely unimaginable, that are completely being, let go and allowed and tolerated. I would say both parties, but now we're talking about, the Republican and about the right. Why is that?
I mean, some of the politicians are scared of primary challenges, and some other people have rationalized it to themselves that it's just people letting off steam and being foolish. It doesn't manifest itself much in anything. Others, I suppose, there's some private sympathies with some of these elements. There's been a lot of rationalizing too. I mean, one thing I'm struck by, I'm older than you, but when I was in school, I mean, people were very interested in studying, of course, the rise of totalitarianism and how did this happen, which anti-Semitism was obviously a major part, and God knows on the right, but also obviously in Stalin and the Soviet Union and elsewhere. And what was striking, and there's a lot of books written, there's a good book called The True Believer, I think, by Eric Hoffer. People were interested in how could you come to believe these doctrines that were really kind of ridiculous and certainly didn't explain history correctly or accurately and were based on lies and so forth. And that was interesting. But for me, the last few years have really shown not just the potency of wanting to believe something and believing especially in conspiracy theories, and then you have social media and a million reasons why people can kind of insulate themselves from critical thinking and from the truth, but also the power not just of believing, but of rationalization. I mean, an awful lot of people can tell themselves, it's distasteful. I wouldn't say that myself. I wouldn't hang out with that person, but this party as a whole, I like some of the policies and they're better for me economically or in other ways, or I don't like them, I'm scared of some aspects of the other party or don't like them. And so I'm sticking with it despite that. And then people like me say, well, that's a pretty big despite, and I mean, at some point, are you going to say ever going to be accountability? And if you don't like that part of the party, are you going to fight it? Are you going to support Liz Cheney, let's say, or, vociferously, or is it okay if the people just hide and don't say anything? And unfortunately, the answer has mostly been, it's fine if people hide and don't say anything. And I think that's, you all have studied this and done this for so many years and decades, and so you have a better sense of this. But, the quiet acquiescence, the rationalization, is a big problem. It's very rare in human history that you get 55% of a country, being rabidly bigoted or anti-Semitic. I mean, race in the US might actually be a bit of an exception, but even there, actually, I'd say it's the going along with the unjust, with the attacks, with the extremism, that sort of is what makes it powerful, right? It's what takes, I think for me, I keep coming back to Trump because it seems to me we've always had these movements in the US. 10%, 15%, 20% maybe of the either the country, or more likely in this case, let's just say the Republican Party or conservative movements, bubble up, and they're so, Father Coughlin and all this, and they're prejudiced and bigoted, and then they kind of bubble down. They don't win, the party moves on. They kind of quietly marginalize these people. Pat Buchanan would be a pretty good example of that, I suppose. Ron Paul, but and so there's a sense that, you don't have to confront. There's, again, too much complacency. David Duke, you don't have to sort of spend all your time watching out for this and confronting it. It kind of just fades away, So in that respect, the happy history, basically, of America has made us, hurts us in a funny way. I mean, in Europe, in some areas, they're much more aware of where this can go. And we're sort of still thinking that, well, it's not going anywhere. This is America. But it's different if it's 2 senators, 1 congressman, a few local officials, 36,000 people scattered around 9 Western states. I'm not making this up, but you know what I mean, as opposed to millions and tens of millions of people in social media bubbles with very well-known demagogues, inciting them and finding every instance to use to further, to exaggerate problems and to blame minorities or various groups for those problems and create lies about those minorities and other groups. So we are in a different situation, but a lot of people want to think it's still the old situation. If you were a Republican member of Congress in '92, you didn't support Pat Buchanan. Maybe if your constituents, some of them liked him, you didn't bother spending a lot of time denouncing him. You were happy when Bush beat him in the primary, and you didn't, lose much sleep about it after the convention.
So I want to turn to the topic of Israel and what the Trump presidency has done for the U.S. support for Israel. Obviously, we at ADL believe firmly that a bipartisan support for Israel is critical. And I would say that probably this change started under President Obama, where the support for Israel kind of started being viewed as more, or at least the Republicans tried to position it as them being stronger supporters of Israel than the Democrat. And today we find ourselves in a very, very dangerous, and I would say difficult position that narrative is kind of sticking. And President Trump did a lot to push that narrative, that his personal support, his party, Republican Party support. Talk to us about that a little bit, and kind of how does that impact not only our foreign policy relations with Israel, but also the impact on anti-Semitism, on how Jews are viewed around the world and in the US specifically?
I mean, I think the Trump administration has presented a particularly complicated, in a way, challenge for you and for some of us who are friends of Israel. I mean, I was a critic of the Obama administration. I mean, I now regret in a couple of cases probably, being overstating how hostile they were to Israel, how, in the height of the Iran deal debate, which was quite an emotional debate and so forth. But even so, I never said they were anti-Semitic, and there were plenty of people I knew in that administration. They just had a different view of what would help peace in the Middle East and so forth. They happened to have a pretty conservative, pretty right-wing Israeli government to deal with, and it was a pretty liberal American government, so there were some of the normal clashes. But again, we've seen that in the past in both ways, right? So, I do think with Trump, you have the complication that he presented himself as being very pro-Israel. There were people in his administration who, I mean, were very pro-Israel, if you just bracket for a minute what that means. But let's just say, they had spent time there, they had lived, they had places there, they were sympathetic to the Israeli government then in power, which was, of course, Netanyahu. And so it got a little more complicated to say that. I remember having a big argument with someone quite prominent, actually, in some Jewish Republican circles after the Tree of Life, when Trump went there with Dermer and Ambassador Dermer, and, gave pretty good remarks. And it was like, well, how can you say this guy is at all a problem for Jews, or for, he gave eloquent remarks. He went there, and he went there with the Israeli ambassador, and he's pursuing policies, some of which I've agreed with, moving the capital to the embassy to Jerusalem and so forth. And in fact, it didn't work out. There wasn't the kind of reaction that liberals or critics predicted. So he was right and the critics were wrong, and then he had the Abraham Accords, which, whatever, the exaggeration of how great they were was not nothing, and was probably on the whole a healthy thing. So, it made it harder to say, well, this is a problem for friends of Israel, which I think ultimately it is. But I think it does, it's not, one has to, I found this sometimes in debating in 2020 when I was supporting Biden, and I was talking to other friendly groups who were mostly Democratic groups who were also pro-Biden. I mean, they understood instinctively what was wrong, I think, with Trump's kind of pro-Israel policies, but they didn't see that it would appeal to a fair number of people who weren't paying super close attention to everything Trump and the Republicans did, who just knew that, I don't know, the Israeli prime minister seems to like him a lot, and he's pursuing what are conventionally viewed as pro-Israel policies, that he says are pro-Israel policies, when they seem to be working okay. And so what's all this talk about anti-Semitism on the right? I don't see it. As son-in-law is obviously Jewish and stuff, and the grandchildren. And so you get that. And it is more complicated. I think it's foolish to pretend that, well, that's just, and the fact that even today, all these, almost all the right-wing members of Congress and so forth are pro-Israel, or say they're pro-Israel. And there are people in Israel who say they're pro-Israel, who are on the right, obviously. And so it is a little more complicated than having just, straight up anti-Semitic party or something where they're anti-Israel, they're anti-Semitic. It's not very complex to understand where they're coming from. And I do think that I think the fact that the Netanyahu government was going to be friendly to any American president, obviously, especially one whose policies they sort of agreed with, but they went out of their way to embrace Trump, and too much, in my opinion. And that had two effects. I meant if you were a Republican-oriented Jew, you sort of thought, see, I mean, the Prime Minister of Israel, President of the United States, what's not to like after all the tension with the Obama years, If you were on the other side, I think, though, if you were skeptical of Netanyahu or skeptical of Trump, it sort of made you less it could make you less pro-Israel. I don't know if it did really, but I was worried about that with young people. So that their image of being pro-Israel would be being Trump, not being George W. Bush, not being Bill Clinton, not being a ton of, the American politicians who were Republicans and Democrats. And I think I do think there's been some price paid there. And there's so much partisanship that any issue is going to get dragged into partisanship too. So we put all that together, it's gotten harder, obviously, to maintain the kind of bipartisan support. Now, the good news is at the end of the day, I think on most Israel-related issues, some of the security issues, there is actually pretty good bipartisan support. And there was that vote on the Iron Dome legislation, and the Republicans tried to make a show of it to highlight the small but real kind of anti-Israel wing of the Democrats in the House. But I mean, they ended up being 8 votes against it or something. So it was a very small wing, and maybe it's maybe not fair to call them anti-Israel exactly, but let's say not friendly to these certain aspects of Israel's security, at least. Anyway, it's a long way of saying I do think it's a more complicated situation today, and that's why I kind of come back to. I mean, believe me, I'm very concerned about the security of Israel, but I think it's easier to make the argument about extremism and bigotry in general in a funny way, And of course, that spills over to the Jews. And I think the Tree of Life is a perfect instance of this. In a way, perfect because he was motivated by anti-Jewish sentiments, to say the least. That's in his manifesto, I believe. But they're partly anti-Jewish because the Jews are too nice to the, other immigrants. So, or not other, to the current, poor immigrants who. The Hebrew, aid society is whatever it's now called, HIAS or something. HIAS, is helping. So was helping. So I think it's a little more complicated than just facing a straight out group that goes back to the Bible to embrace anti-Semitic themes and hates and wants Israel, sympathetic to the Arab, to the Middle Eastern opponents of Israel and so forth. That's a little different from the current situation.
Bill, I want to continue just on Israel for a moment and really reference back to the evangelical movement. When President Trump decided to move the embassy, there were a lot of hypotheses behind what was the motivation. And obviously one of it was the evangelical movement and their real desire to see that happen. And I can tell you that, at the ceremony in Jerusalem when this was happening, if you looked at the audience, majority of evangelicals, very few actually American Jews, American Jewish organizations, very, very few. So what is your assessment of that and the influence of the evangelical movement on the Trump presidency specifically, and in regards to our issues specifically?
So I think they had some influence. I also think they just weren't, this was an easy issue to appeal to them on Trump's part as well. So I don't know which way the influence went exactly. That's a complicated story. I mean, people, I know, and me myself to some degree, we're always thought it was good for Israel to have more supporters rather than fewer. And it would be helpful to have supporters among Christian conservatives because they're a major part of the constituency of at least one party. It used to be some of them in the other party as well. And it would be bad for Israel to be entirely the sort of, defended by secular liberals. I mean, really, they're not a majority in the United States. And, ultimately, in a democracy, you've got to care about the people. Now, and to be fair, a lot of the Christian evangelical support of Israel, I think, was good-hearted and not based on crazy, apocalyptic visions, but just based on they kind of like Israel, what they know about it. It's a Western country. After 9/11, I think there's a lot of common sentiment that we were fighting the same terrorists. Some of that sentiment was authentic and reasonable, I think. Some of it was a little bit tinged with, anti-Islam bias and stuff. But either way, it did lead them to be quite pro-Israel, quite sympathetic to Israel. I've been in Israel, as you have, and seen, many church groups, especially in the last 10, 15 years, not so much when I was younger, visiting sites, and they're moved by it and, so forth. So I think it's a mistake to be too dismissive of that or wish it weren't the case. Having said that, I do feel, again, in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, especially, it's morphed into something sort of different. I mean, it's now just part of a kind of catalog of issues which they use to beat up the left and to, which they've weaponized as well. And that's bad and unfortunate. It's a free country. You can't stop people from saying what they want about, why they like Israel and why other people don't and so forth. I think the best response, and this is very strong pro-Israel actions by people who aren't Christian evangelicals. I mean, the best thing is not to be some, secular liberal who actually doesn't care about Israel and does nothing to help Israel, in support of Israel or in support of, or to fight anti-Semitism and sits around with other issues as his or her priority, which obviously it's a free country, they can do what they want. But the more people are like that, the Christians say, well, who is fighting for Israel? We're the only ones who care, Is anyone else showing up to care about this sort of thing? So I think it would be, the more we can have a broader coalition, obviously, of concern for Israel and Israel's well-being. And the more the Israeli government can then work with a bunch of people over here and not be as exclusive, too strong, but focus so much on the Christian evangelicals, I think that would be a mistake. I think when I first got to Washington, I thought there was the opposite problem, that there was a sense the traditional organizations were mostly run, of course, by liberals and moderates, but very much being comfortable with a, Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy, et cetera, Democratic Party, Mondale, all these traditional pro-Israel politicians. They were a little put off or worried about Reagan and some of these, people they didn't know as well, and some of these senators from states where there were much smaller Jewish populations and so forth. And I think they were a little late in a sense in realizing, no, we need to work with them too. Though I would say AIPAC, ADL, the major groups saw that pretty quickly and did pretty good work on that. I remember, this is kind of a funny story, it's like another era. So my boss, Dan Quayle, when I was his chief of staff in the George H.W. Bush White House. So I hadn't known him that well until I went to work for him in the White House. And I was domestic policy advisor for a few months, and then became chief of staff. And we were talking once, I don't remember how it came up, and he was very pro-Israel. It's really the most pro-Israel of the Bush senior team. And it actually came out at times in some internal debates. And I think we did a fair amount actually in 1991 at the Gulf War with Ambassador Chauvel to kind of paper over or try to prevent some of the fights, as you recall, between the Bush-Baker administration, Bush White House and Baker State Department on the one hand, and the Shamir government on the other, from getting out of control. Anyway, so Quayle did a good job, but he was very pro-Israel and knew quite a lot. And I remember asking him, if you don't mind me asking, I said, where does that come from? He grew up in part of Indiana that wasn't a huge Jewish presence. Then he ended up, then he represented that part of the state and then the state as a whole. And he said, it was kind of funny that he said, yeah, it's interesting. The Jewish community of Indiana was very fond of the incumbent Democratic Senator Birch Bayh in 1980, who had been a major figure in the Democratic Party and pro-Israel, and who was this young 34-year-old, whatever he was, congressman who had no connection really, challenging him. So they were all for Bayh. He said he had no support, except for one man, Hart Haston, who ran the Orthodox day school. Wouldn't run it, but he funded I think it's called the Hart Haston School, maybe now or something, in Indianapolis, who was conservative. He was sort of an old, I think he knew, I don't think he literally knew Jabotinsky, but he was sort of an old Beitar sort of type and knew Begin for years and raised money for him in the US and stuff. And he was conservative, and he was, so he became a supporter of Quayle, not for Israel reasons, but just for American political reasons, but he was very pro-Israel. And so Quayle got to know him quite well, actually. I remember him visiting the White House. And so Quayle sort of accidentally, you might say, had more exposure to and knowledge about Israel than a typical, perhaps, senator in that kind of position. Anyway, but I do think the groups, or, ADL, AIPAC, the others, the AJC, adjusted to the new realities of the 80s and 90s pretty well, actually, and pretty careful to show that they were equally open to people in both parties. But then it got, now I think the pressure's from the other direction. So yeah. It's important for the groups to adjust, but it's also important for politicians in the parties and younger politicians to do so. And I think the most dangerous thing on the Democratic side is this narrative, which isn't really true, incidentally, but the older generation of Democrats is pro-Israel, but the younger generation are all at best skeptical and at worst, hostile and sort of like they're like the European left. And there is some of that, of course, and universities are a problem, but there are a heck of a lot of young pro-Israel Democratic members of Congress, for example. I know a lot of them personally, and they're very impressive. And I think giving them a little higher profile wouldn't hurt here in the US. I'm sure you all do that anyway, but here in Virginia, we have, Abigail Spanberger, who's a member of Congress, Elaine Luria, who's Jewish, I believe. I think that's a famous Jewish name, isn't it? And Luria, I think the one time I met her, we had a conversation whether she was related to the great Luria and the great Kabbalist. I think her family pretended that they were, but they don't know, of course. But anyway, no, but I mean, people like that should be better known. You know what I mean? Everyone's sort of the only Democrats anyone knows are Ilhan Omar, not the only ones anyone knows, but the ones that Fox News and the Republican Party tries to highlight are Ilhan Omar and AOC and so forth. And there are a lot who are genuinely internationalists, genuinely liberal in the good sense, I would say, in the old-fashioned sense about pluralism and tolerance, and genuinely pro-Israel. So I think it'd be worth doing more to get them a little more visibility.
So, Bill, I want to ask you my last question, and then we're going to go to the audience. And I want to kind of end on a note of optimism. What do you think is the most optimistic note regarding kind of anti-Semitism in the right? What are the positive trends? What are hopeful trends that you can point to today for our audience? And how could we kind of magnify those if there are any?
Well, I think, again, these people like these young members of Congress are a good instance that I don't think young people are. I mean, some of them on college campuses get taught anti-Israel, courses and so forth. And there's quite a lot of activity on the other side, but I think the American public remains pretty sound. I just think bolstering, I mean, we should all criticize the bad things, obviously, and worry about them and fight them. I mean, that's very, very important. But we also need to boost the good things, I would say, and the good aspects, the strong aspects. And at the end of the day, I mean, we should be alarmed. I mean, you never know, things can change quickly. But again, if you look at the obstacles Jews in America had in the past, if you look at the obstacles Israel had in the past, if you look at, one shouldn't be too, it's a little tricky being suitably alarmed without being alarmist and sort of the boy who cries wolf. And, as most American Jews look around and they don't feel like, the people are coming for them the next day, or that they're being discriminated against or something. And some of the discrimination, if there is some, could be not quite from the left, but it's not just traditional right-wing discrimination and so forth. So I would say strengthening the positive forces here in America, as well as fighting the really terrible negative ones. And I guess the other thing I'd say is really we need to deal with extremism and bigotry across the board. I mean, that I think has to be the rallying cry. And again, it may not look terrible now, and it's been mostly constrained. The Capitol was probably the worst moment on January 6th, apart from Tree of Life in particular, and attacks obviously that cost people's lives. But you just don't know how quickly it could spin out of control, and that's why it is important to be vigilant about these things without being, hysterical, obviously.
Absolutely. And we are so thrilled that you are an important voice and voice of reason at this very critical moment. I want to turn to some questions. I'm not going to start thanking you yet because we have good questions in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'll start reading some of them that have been kind of filtered by Shira. Isn't it true that the anti-Semitism in Europe cannot be blamed on the rise in the US or anything to do with Trump? It's the biggest, longest virus, worse than COVID, independent of any individual.
So I think, look, my impression is until the last few years, there was mostly on the left that people were very worried about anti-Semitism, or certainly anti-Israel sentiments in Europe, and some anti-Semitism. And Jeremy Corbyn, let's say, the most anti-Israel leader of either major party in Britain for decades, is a Labour Party leader, not a conservative leader. So that's correct. That can't be blamed on Trump. That's the other side of the spectrum. Now, I do think the recent developments in Hungary and elsewhere, Poland, the use of George Soros as a kind of signal or whatever you want to say,
Dog whistle.
Dog whistle. Yeah, that's good. Right. That's more on the right. And that I do think there's been some spillover from Trump and then some spillover from Europe to Trump and to Trumpists here. And we see that explicitly when they have a nationalist conference in Hungary. And again, nationalism, that could be a term that could be innocuous enough. There have been plenty of Jewish national, Israeli nationalists. You can find quotations from very decent people saying we should be proud of our nation and stuff. And same here, but it spills over if you look at the rhetoric to it's the nation, and then it's the nation has to fight off all these terrible foreign, intrusions, and then it becomes the immigrants, and then it's the Jews who are helping the immigrants, and also it's the Christian nation that's really strong, that's being undercut by this, and then they finally end up in a funny way, they back into, I would almost say, to get to the kind of old-fashioned anti-Semitism. I often think that's not really the start of it often, but then they discover, wow, there's a whole tradition here that I can exploit, and literature really that we can use. And so that then gets brought back to life almost, as you were saying, with the replacement theory and so forth.
I would add that we at ADL did a report in 2019 called The Internationalization of White Supremacy. And for our audience members who asked about this, the report specifically documents and provides evidence of the mutual influence of white supremacy in America on Europe, and from Europe, we covered 5 countries in Europe on the US. So, and we tracked and monitored and specifically demonstrated how the manifestos of many of the really violent acts that have happened actually refer to and cite and uphold examples from Europe in America, including the Tree of Life. So there's definitely, I agree with you that this kind of spillage is there, the mutual enforcement and the influencing is there. And we are at a moment that these global issues just do not know borders, and boundaries have become less of a matter. It's not an issue anymore. So
which was always the case. We think of, obviously, given the ghastliness of what happened in Germany, we think of that as unique, and it is unique in so many ways. But I mean, there was so anti-Semitism, and everywhere, and in fact, much stronger in other countries, arguably stronger in France than in Germany in 1895, and in Russia, and so we forget how much of and in the U.S. in the 20s, and 30s, Henry Ford and stuff. So we forget how much of it's always been a kind of international problem, and with the same spillage back and forth. I believe people quoting Henry Ford over in Germany and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, going to the next question is a little bit more local. How should Jews in North Carolina handle Republicans like Madison Cawthorn, who, for example, has admitted that he has attempted to convert Jews to Christianity, among other problematic anti-Semitic acts? Any thoughts on that? I mean, that's really challenging.
Yeah, I mean, people, need to make their own political decisions, but I think, they have to, I'd say they, should oppose them as they choose, or if it's not their district, I guess they can just stay out of it. What I said before, we both said, I think is relevant here. So if you're not in his district, I mean, you don't get to vote for or against him. On the other hand, he has colleagues, many of them Republican, who haven't said anything one way or the other. They're not themselves like Cawthorn in that respect, most of them, I don't think, but they should be asked to denounce him, and they should be asked in letters and at town hall meetings and in other ways to make clear that they're not with him on that. I think there's been too much tolerance of the tolerance of the fellow members of the people of the worst people, and I think they need to be put on the spot, even if it's uncomfortable for them, because we need to get them on the record, and also just alert them to, they don't personally, if they're not Jewish, most of them, they watch this stuff happen, they think, oh, that's kind of a little weird, but they don't take it seriously. And I think that's where getting more people to take, you're not going to change Madison Cawthorn, but you could change the decent people in North Carolina and get them more alarmed and more outspoken about Madison Cawthorn.
I agree. Next question says, I observed conservative friends / colleagues during the Trump administration suddenly being appalled at anti-Semitism and defending Israel, championing the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, etc. It felt more about like an opportunity to align with and defend Trump than sincere, sustainable concern around Jewish issues. Any sense of whether this is actually happening? Was it just opportunistic, do you believe? You touched on it.
It could well have, I think obviously each case is different, but yes, there was a fair amount of that. Now, when looked at, I remember arguing with people about, like in the Jerusalem thing, some people just thought it was a bad idea. You know, people who served in the Obama administration thought it was risky. Jordan, what happened with there, it wasn't crazy to be worried about that. It turned out, I think, not to be particularly problematic. But I remember talking to them and saying, look, if you want to criticize that move, that's just a policy question. Of course, you can criticize it. The costs outweigh the benefits. I think you get into tricky ground when you start saying, well, they're only doing it for this reason, or people are only supporting it for this reason. Because at the end of the day, if the policy is a reasonable policy, it's pretty hard to tell in most cases exactly what mix of motivations people have. And so, you know, support the good policies and criticize the bad ones. And, but above all, criticize the extremism and intolerance, I would say. I think it goes, it's not, I think it's somewhat counterproductive almost. If some people you don't like, or an administration many people didn't like, does one or two things that, even for bad reasons maybe, that are reasonable things, you just look a little silly, you know, saying, well, they're doing it for bad reasons, you know, and I don't like Jared Kushner or Ambassador Friedman, so I'm going to say that these Abraham Accords, and they're also have a ridiculous name in a way, right? Abraham Accords, and they're being oversold. So I'm just going to say they're worthless or they're terrible. Well, that just at some point people look up 6 months later and say, I don't know, it seems like there's actually flights going back and forth to the UAE from Israel. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's not just for right wingers either. I mean, you know, Foreign Minister Lapid is also building on these accords, not just the Netanyahu government. So I think people have to be careful to sort of not, you know, just become so hostile to all the people on the other side, even if some of them deserve hostility, believe me, to sort of, you know, be automatically against everything they do.
I would argue that the Abraham Accords are fundamentally changed the geostrategic dynamic of the Middle East. So that could be another conversation. But I definitely, again, with all the downfalls of the Trump administration, that was definitely deserves credit for. Next question, will those who feel alienated from the Republican Party now be able to find the reshaped Republican Party where they feel welcome? I mean, this is optimistic, maybe looking to the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't know. The whole, everything from 2015 to 2021 happened pretty fast. So maybe the opposite could happen pretty fast. I'm pretty pessimistic about the next 2-3 years. I just think, practically speaking, it looks like the kinds of people who can be nominated in 2022 are pretty much from the populist, nationalist, populist, somewhat authoritarian wing of the party. And I'm not too thrilled about 2024. And I don't know that independent parties or candidates, third parties or independent candidacies are very practical in the short term. So look, I have friends who are fighting within the Republican Party. I have friends who are running for office. People like me have probably more moved over to say, look, for now, I think the better bet is to work to strengthen the good forces in the Democratic Party, where there are some of these arguments going on, as your previous webinar showed, and you know, and help them, because I think, you know, we have two parties for now, and we should help whichever people who can help in one or both. The good thing about being the ADL or about being an individual citizen is you can work with people in both parties, you know, and people have, it's so important to reestablish that tradition to some degree. And so I don't think people should feel they have to all choose sides. Now, again, if you're elected office, it's a little different. If you're a major fundraiser for one party or something, or an activist or a volunteer or an official in the local party, then yeah, then you're sort of in one party. But even so, incidentally, very important to pay tribute to decent people in the other party. Very important to say, you know, well, look, what Liz Cheney's doing is admirable, or what, you know, some Democrat is doing is on the other side is admirable, or the Biden administration got this right or that wrong. I think it's very important to try to, the partisanship cannot, the excessive partisanship and polarization cannot be healthy for Israel ultimately. And I think it can't be healthy for Jews. I mean, I just think Jews do better in a society typically where there's a general ethos of tolerance and understanding, and including understanding that there'll be political differences, including among Jews, obviously. And, you know, it's even if you're temporarily on the winning side of a highly partisan or polarized situation, it can change overnight. The winning side can change, and also the people can change their judgment of you, you know. And so I think I think we have a huge interest in anything that can be done to restore some bipartisanship and some nonpartisanship on some of these issues, both domestic and foreign.
That's a perfect bridge to the next question, which talks about the American Jewry appearing to be very divided on issues today and compared to the 1980s, for example. Do you see this divisiveness as impeding efforts to oppose anti-Semitism? It's a good question.
It's a good question. And, there's a little bit, we're also susceptible to kind of nostalgia for the past when everything was great. And I remember being in some debate and it was like, oh, it's never been this bad. And for Israel and the US, this was someone who's very concerned about what's happening on some campuses. And there are real grounds of concern, as you all know, at the ADL. And I mean, you sort of say, well, let's go back to 1948. We didn't actually, Truman was great, but Israel did not get arms from the US. Israel got arms from, France and Czechoslovakia. And let's go back to 56, where we didn't exactly step up and help Israel, in 67, where Johnson did nothing to open the straits. I mean, people can be a little, you forget what it was like in the past. The same with divisions in the Jewish community. I mean, there were pretty strong divisions and bitter arguments in the Jewish community at different times on different axes, on religion, on church-state issues, on foreign policy issues, and so forth. But I am worried that there's a certain tendency on the right to say, well, we're with the Orthodox, basically, the observant, the more conservative socially, the Jews are more conservative socially, and that's kind of our base. And then the other party gets the, more liberal, secular, well, secular is not right, but just more liberal Jews. Let's just play to our base. Again, very important, I think, that not happen. I think it's just bad for the Jewish community, for one thing, and bad for the political influence of American Jews. So I would encourage like Democrats to reach out to their modern Orthodox friends and Republicans to reach out to their Reform and or more non-attending Jewish friends, because it's not good if the community just gets split in a political and partisan way. And I think there's a little more of that than they used to be. I mean, that's mostly an internal Jewish issue, I think, it's mostly due to internal frictions, obviously. Yeah. But
yes. But like all communities, it's Jews are not exceptional, but we definitely have that divisions within our communities as well. I want to end on a practical question that was asked. What practical and grassroots recommendations do you have for conservatives to counter anti-Semitism on the right?
So it's a good question. I would say this, that I think, I don't know who's on this call, but people on this call, I'm going to generalize, are interested, I'm sure, in national politics, and they read national sources of opinion, and they follow things at the national or international level, which is great. And everyone should obviously be involved in whatever they want. But we forget American politics is unusual. Politics in the United States is unusual because it really is federal. I mean, there really are 50 states that elect 2 senators each. They each have governors. I think the pandemic, for better or worse, I think often for worse, reminded us how strong state governments are and how much difference they can make and state legislatures can make. And how much, and of course, the red America, blue America stuff is bad, and it's worse, much more polarized than it used to be. But it's also a reminder that the local politics really matters. So I think it would be good if people looked at their own community, looked at their own city or county, look at their mayors and governors and state legislators and members of Congress, and think, how can I affect them? I think it's a little bit too much. It's fine to, of course, affect the national discourse, and that's great if you can do that, or, get the Secretary of State to change his mind about something. But I think people forget how much clout they can have locally, and including on members of Congress. And if one person doesn't have clout, certainly a group of 20 or 50 can have clout. And just letting them know that you're watching. This gets back to the Madison Cawthorn. I mean, some people have just made up their mind they're going to be a certain kind of rabble-rouser, a demagogue, and that's that. But a lot of them are just minding their own business, so to speak, in North Carolina. I haven't looked closely at this delegation, but I'm just going to assert that. And they would certainly, of course, members of Congress will take visits or have, from delegations, or their staff at least would see people, and people can go to town halls and so forth. And I think it would make a big difference if, I'll put it this way. It's annoying, it's very depressing to see, for me, some of these members of Congress and some of the people running in these primaries. And I'm very depressed and angry about the general accommodation to Trump. Still, having said that, on the Republican side, makes a big difference if it's 70% people who are quiet and 25% who are rabid supporters of the demagogue. Because 7% are quiet, shouldn't be quiet, but at least they potentially can sort of stop being quiet, as opposed to 70% who are rabid supporters. So I think it's very important to people should vote for whom they want, obviously, and maybe they don't want to vote for that 70% if they're not standing up to the demagogues. But if they are in touch with those people, if they are potential supporters for them, or even if they're not supporters, if they're just constituents, very important to encourage those people to do the right thing, even if they don't do it quite as vehemently or promptly or boldly as some of us might like. And so I think don't give up. I mean, I say this somewhat contrary to my own interest, which is I'm sort of fed up with the party and slightly pessimistic about the next 2 years. But I think it matters, and especially, final point, for the non-federal races. At some point, the federal party, the national party, the members of Congress will follow national trends and a president or a nominee of their party. And there's a limit to how much you're going to persuade some member of Congress to stand up to Trump if he or she isn't inclined to. Mayors, governors, whole different story. So on the Republican side, the governors really are different. I mean, Baker in Massachusetts and Hogan in Maryland and Scott in Vermont and others. Even the governors of many red states actually are quite different from the senators, and they go along with some stuff I wish they didn't. They're not critical of some things that they should be critical of, but they're much less, they do have to govern, and they have to represent, they have to deal with those communities in very real ways. So I think, again, seeing where people can have influence at the state and local level and trying to have influence, a lot of those mayors and members of city councils will end up being members of Congress. And so, working with them early on, instead of just despairing and thinking it's hopeless because you happen to have the bad luck of having a terrible senator or something like that, I think is important. It is a big country, hard to change people, change these big, these big trends happen, and they can be negative, and it's worrisome and depressing. But the good thing about the US is it's also very susceptible to changing, and people really can make a difference. So I think it's probably a little more at the state and local level than we sometimes think.
So get engaged locally. Bill, you have been so generous with your time. I personally want to thank you. I want to hand it over to Danielle Weiss, who's going to close us out. But thank you all for allowing me to have this wonderful conversation with Bill.
Thank you.
Danielle.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danielle Weiss. I'm chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. Before we conclude our program tonight and overall this enlightening series on anti-Semitism, a bipartisan problem that demands a nonpartisan solution, I'd like to take a moment to thank Sharon Nazarian for guiding this insightful discussion, and Bill Kristol for sharing your insight and deep expertise as a Washington insider, advising many political leaders on the right. And for this dose of optimism, I think we all appreciate that you reminded us that America is a great country. It is susceptible to change, and that it's important to work to encourage our leaders and ourselves to do the right thing. This series has truly illustrated that the pernicious rise of anti-Semitism in our society must be taken very seriously, and that we have work to do to defeat it, all of us. We know that as individuals, we can have the greatest impact in countering anti-Semitism on our own sides of the aisle. And we hope that after attending this series, you're feeling more prepared to speak out and educate others who share your political affiliation if you ever hear anti-Semitic remarks. Before we say goodnight, I want to thank ADL for being such a great partner on this important series, and thank each one of you for joining us. I want to quickly mention a few upcoming programs that we're hosting in the next few weeks. First, on Tuesday, November 30th, JCRC-ADL and AJC are holding a press conference for the Shine a Light on Anti-Semitism initiative with a group of elected officials and community leaders at Love Park. And on Sunday, December 5th, JCRC is partnering with the City of Philadelphia for a Hanukkah menorah lighting on Boathouse Row. Please keep an eye out for more information on both of these events in your email. Wishing you all a very wonderful Thanksgiving and a happy, happy Hanukkah. Enjoy the rest of your evening.